What most people don't realize is that silence is not the absence of action, it is a very precise form of action. When you choose not to respond, not to explain, not to defend yourself, you are stepping outside the psychological game entirely, and that is where the real shift begins. A narcissist operates through a system of control that depends heavily on predictability. They study your reactions, your emotions, your triggers. Over time, they learn exactly which words will provoke you, which situations will make you anxious, and which pressures will force you to engage. In a sense, they build a map of your inner world and then they use that map to navigate and dominate it. But the moment you go silent, that map becomes useless. Your silence removes the feedback loop they rely on. There is no reaction to analyze, no emotion to manipulate, no response to twist. And without that feedback, their sense of control begins to collapse. What once felt like a structured dynamic suddenly turns into uncertainty. They can no longer predict you, and unpredictability is something they are deeply uncomfortable with. This is where the psychological tension starts to rise, not in you, but in them. They may attempt to provoke you more aggressively, escalate their behavior, or even shift tactics entirely. But underneath all of it, there is a growing instability, because control for them is not just a preference, it is a necessity, and your silence quietly removes it. So what looks like doing nothing on the surface is, in reality, a powerful redefinition of the dynamic. You are no longer participating in a system designed to diminish you. You are stepping beyond it. And here is the truth worth holding on to. The moment you stop feeding their control is the moment you begin reclaiming your own. If you look closely at the dynamic, you begin to see that what appears to be confidence in a narcissist is often sustained by something far more fragile, an ongoing need for external input. Attention, validation, emotional reactions, these are not just pleasant additions to their world, they are psychological fuel. Without it, their sense of self begins to lose stability. This is what is often described as supply. But it is important to understand this not as a label, but as a mechanism. A narcissist does not generate a stable inner identity in the way a grounded individual does. Instead, they construct it moment by moment through the responses of others. Your admiration, your frustration, even your anger, all of it becomes material they use to reinforce their sense of importance and control. Now consider what happens when that flow is interrupted. When you choose silence, you are not merely withholding words, you are withdrawing the very resource they depend on to maintain their psychological structure. There is no validation to absorb, no emotional reaction to reinterpret, no engagement to sustain the illusion of dominance. And without that, something unsettling begins to emerge within them. At first, it may appear as irritation, then it deepens into restlessness, and eventually it can become a form of quiet panic. Because the absence of supply does not just create discomfort, it creates a void, and that void forces them, however briefly, to confront a version of themselves that is no longer being constantly reinforced from the outside. This is why silence is so powerful. It does not attack, it does not argue, it does not justify. It simply removes the fuel. And in doing so, it reveals a deeper truth. What they seem to possess so effortlessly was never truly self-sustained. So when you withdraw your attention, you are not depriving them out of spite, you are restoring balance by no longer participating in a system that feeds instability. And perhaps the most important realization is this: the energy you stop giving them is the energy you begin to reclaim for yourself. There is a subtle but profound shift that occurs when silence enters the dynamic, one that is often overlooked. It is not simply that the narcissist loses control, it is that they lose orientation. Their entire approach depends on a kind of psychological script, an internal expectation of how interactions will unfold. They anticipate your reactions, prepare their responses, and move through the exchange with a calculated sense of direction. But silence interrupts that script in a way nothing else can. When you do not respond as expected, you introduce a kind of ambiguity they are not equipped to handle. There is no clear signal, no emotional cue, no indication of where they stand. And this absence creates a form of psychological dissonance. They begin to question not necessarily themselves in a deep, reflective sense, but the situation. The lack of clarity becomes unsettling. In many ways, human beings are wired to seek patterns and meaning. Even in conflict, there is a certain structure that provides a sense of familiarity. But your silence removes that. structure. It replaces certainty with uncertainty and predictability with confusion. And for someone who relies heavily on control, this is deeply destabilizing. What follows is often a rapid escalation of behavior. They may repeat themselves, intensify their tone, or attempt entirely new strategies to provoke a response. Not because they are consciously strategizing at every moment, but because they are trying almost instinctively to restore a sense of psychological order. They need to re-establish the pattern, to bring the interaction back into something they can understand and manage. But the more consistent your silence, the more that order slips away. And here is where the deeper shift occurs. The confusion they experience is not something you have imposed upon them, it is something that was always there, simply hidden beneath the illusion of control. Your silence does not create the instability, it reveals it. So when you resist the urge to explain, to react, to fill the silence, you are allowing the dynamic to unfold without interference. You are no longer participating in the maintenance of a system that depends on your predictability. And in that space, something powerful emerges. Clarity on your side and uncertainty on theirs. Because in the end, the one who is no longer predictable is the one who can no longer be controlled. There is a paradox at the heart of human attention that becomes especially visible in this dynamic. What is constantly available is rarely valued, and what withdraws suddenly becomes significant. A narcissist over time often grows accustomed to your presence, your attention, your effort, your willingness to engage. It becomes a given, something assumed rather than appreciated. But the moment you step back into silence, that assumption is disrupted. What was once predictable is now absent. And absence has a peculiar psychological effect. It creates space for projection. They begin to wonder where your attention has gone, what you are thinking, whether they have lost their influence. The same person they once overlooked or took for granted now becomes a point of focus. This is not because your intrinsic value has suddenly changed. It is because your availability has. When you were consistently present, they did not need to seek you, you were already there. But silence introduces distance, and distance creates tension. It forces them into a position they are unfamiliar with, pursuit. They may reach out more frequently, attempt to provoke a reaction, or even present themselves differently in an effort to regain your attention. What is important to understand here is that this shift is not necessarily rooted in genuine reflection or emotional growth. It is often driven by the discomfort of losing access, of no longer being in control of the connection. The dynamic has inverted. The one who once reacted is now observing, and the one who once controlled is now seeking. And in that inversion, something becomes clear. Your value was never defined by how much you gave, but by how much you were willing to withhold. Not in a manipulative sense, but in the recognition that your attention is not an unlimited resource to be distributed without awareness. It is something that gains meaning through intention and restraint. So when you choose silence, you are not playing a game, you are altering the structure of the interaction itself. You are no longer reinforcing a pattern where your presence is expected and your absence is impossible, and the result is unavoidable. What they once ignored, they begin to chase. Because in the end, people rarely pursue what they already believe they own, but they will always pursue what they feel they are losing. What often remains unseen in these dynamics is what happens when the external noise finally disappears. When there is no longer someone reacting, no longer someone arguing back, no longer someone providing emotional resistance, the entire structure that was previously projected outward begins to collapse inward. And what is left is not strength, it is exposure. A narcissist, when engaged, is never fully alone with themselves. There is always a dialogue happening externally, someone to blame, someone to provoke, someone to validate their shifting emotional state. This constant externalization protects them from a deeper confrontation with their own inner instability. It is not just about control over others, it is also about avoiding contact with their own unresolved internal world. But silence removes that protection. When you step back and refuse to participate, the external scaffolding begins to disappear. There is no longer an immediate emotional mirror reflecting their sense of superiority or grievance. And in that absence, something uncomfortable emerges. The unfiltered self, no longer shaped by reaction or resistance. This is where their inner chaos becomes more visible. Not because you have caused it, but because you are no longer absorbing it. The emotions they previously projected onto you, anger, insecurity, confusion no longer have a place to land. And when projection has nowhere to go, it returns to its source. That return is rarely peaceful. What follows can be restlessness, irritation, or even emotional escalation. But beneath those surface reactions lies something deeper, an inability to comfortably sit with oneself without external reinforcement. It is as if the silence has removed the noise that was disguising an underlying disorganization. From a psychological perspective, this is a critical moment, not for them to be judged, but to be understood, because it reveals that much of what appeared as dominance or certainty was actually dependent on constant relational input. Remove that input, and the structure becomes unstable. And this is where your silence takes on its full meaning. You are no longer participating in the maintenance of their emotional projection system. You are no longer carrying what was never yours to hold. In that space, clarity begins to form not only about them, but about your own position outside of that cycle. And perhaps the most important realization is this: when the noise stops, what remains is not your responsibility to fix, but your signal to step fully out of it. When we reach the final layer of this understanding, something important needs to be corrected, because silence is often misunderstood. People confuse it with avoidance, weakness, or emotional withdrawal. But psychologically, it is none of these. True silence is not an absence of engagement. It is the conscious removal of participation in a destructive system. From a deeper perspective, every human interaction carries an exchange of energy, attention, emotion, interpretation. In a narcissistic dynamic, that exchange becomes imbalanced. One side gives constantly, while the other takes, reframes, and redirects. Over time, this creates a subtle erosion of self-awareness in the person who is overengaged. They begin to define themselves through reaction rather than intention. Silence interrupts this pattern. When you stop responding in the way the system expects, you are no longer reinforcing the loop. And this is where many misunderstand the process. They think silence is passive, that it means doing nothing. But psychologically, it is highly active. It is the act of reclaiming attention from something that has been consuming it without return. From a Jungian lens, this can be seen as a movement away from projection. You are no longer carrying what belongs to the other person's inner instability. You are no longer allowing your emotional world to be shaped as a response to their unresolved internal conflicts. Instead, you begin to re-establish boundaries between what is yours and what is not. And in that separation, something stabilizes within you. The need to explain diminishes. The urgency to be understood fades. The compulsion to fix or resolve someone else's emotional state begins to dissolve. What replaces it is a quieter but stronger form of awareness, one that is not reactive, but observational. This is why silence is not simply a tactic. It is a correction, a return to psychological integrity. And naturally, from the outside, this will be interpreted in many ways. Some may call it indifference. Others may misread it as distance or coldness. But internally, it is something very different. It is the realignment of your attention with your own inner world. Because once you stop participating in what drains you, you begin to notice something essential. Your mind becomes clearer, your emotions become steadier, and your perception of reality becomes less distorted. And that is the final truth. This silence reveals not what it does to them, but what it restores in you. In the end, silence is not about winning a psychological game. It is about no longer playing a game that costs you your own clarity.